Hello, class. So the content for the course begins. This is week 1. You'll be reading in the Woodhouse text. There it is. A preface to philosophy. I'm going to be giving a short lecture here. Short, I'm guessing it'll be less than 30 minutes. Trying to help you with some of the reading and some of the concepts. A couple of things. I'm going to be providing these lectures with PowerPoint periodically throughout the class. They should not be used as a replacement for the reading. Rather, it should be used as a supplement for the reading. So I'm not going to touch on all the points that the reading makes. You're not going to be able to write an adequate reading reflection just based on the lecture. But I'm going to try to give examples, make it tangible, sort of help some of the principles maybe come to life. So hopefully these lectures will definitely help. If I were you, I'd probably listen to the lectures first and look at PowerPoints and whatnot, and then do the reading for that particular day. If there's no lecture, obviously just do the reading. But I think these might help make the reading a little bit easier. The PowerPoints will also be included in a folder on Angel under Content so that you can access these PowerPoints at any time. So, a preface to philosophy, Woodhouse. Let's sort of get started a little bit. So in chapter 3, there's a couple of bolded sections, right? One of them says the choice between competing theories is based on reason and does not require absolute certainty. You can see this on page 37 there. Basically, Woodhouse starts out by suggesting that philosophy is not just opinion. It's not just a bunch of people making statements that have no support, talking past one another with no sort of evidence or argumentation. Just the opposite. Philosophy is about evaluating ideas, trying to use consistent criteria and principles that can help us determine where strong points are and where weak points are in political arguments, moral arguments, theological arguments, metaphysical arguments about God, about the human soul, human nature, other things. So philosophy gets a set of theories together, and then they begin to analyze, ask tough questions, engage in rational and critical thinking. And over time, some of those are weeded out, and others sort of come to the surface. But that process never stops. One of the things about this that I love is, if you look at the pointer here, it does not require absolute certainty. We typically, on complicated issues, we typically do not come to a place of absolute certainty. Rather, we make arguments based on probability, and we show that some theories, answers, arguments are very improbable, given the evidence, given principles of critical thinking. Others become more and more probable. Again, if you go down here, one of the other bullet points of Woodhouse is philosophy often attempts to avoid relativism. I shared with you in the introduction a little about this. So philosophy is trying to evaluate ideas and arguments in such a way not that necessarily leads to certainty or the absolute truth, but based on probability, we say these answers seem to be more cohesive, more probable, stronger than these others. So we avoid relativism because we're saying, look, not all answers are equally valid. Not all opinions or beliefs or arguments are true. Some are better than others. Some are closer to the truth than others. Some might be absolutely true. And in doing that, we avoid relativism, and we also are able to avoid the arrogance that says, I own the truth. This is clearly right. Whoever disagrees with me not only disagrees with me, but also disagrees with God, because this is absolutely the case. And both extremes bother me, which is why I like Woodhouse, because he carves out this middle place for philosophy where we pursue truth, we weed out the bad, we pursue the good, we avoid relativism, but we also avoid dogmatism. And the two extremes bother me for multiple reasons. The extreme of dogmatism, where I know the absolute truth, No one can disagree with me without clearly being wrong. This has created lots of problems historically. I could give lots of examples, but some of the major examples you're well aware of. Anytime a person is so convinced that they're right and everyone else is wrong, that person is often willing to kill for their beliefs. So we have Catholics butchering Protestants and vice versa. We've got the Puritans coming over to the United States and butchering Native Americans. We have Nazis butchering Jews. We have Muslim extremists flying planes into buildings. So convinced that they're right, that God is on their side, that they couldn't possibly be wrong, that they are willing to kill others as a result. We see this time and time again because of this certainty. We see it in the church in divisions. We're so certain that we're right, we'll break away from you, start our own denomination, excommunicate, judge, sort of divide. And this happens over and over. The other extreme is also problematic, and it's sort of an epidemic in younger generations. My least favorite word in the English language is whatever. Ugh, I dislike that word so much. Whatever, Professor Bankard, whatever you want. Sure, okay, no problem. Like you don't care, no passion. You don't even want to pursue the truth. You don't even want to do the hard work to evaluate arguments, ideas, evidence, ask tough questions of yourself and others, of your faith. It's just whatever. Leave me alone. I'll do whatever I want as long as it doesn't hurt someone else. Get out of my business. And that kind of relativism is not only lazy, but obviously it allows tyrants to sort of have their way. It allows for things that are blatantly false to be called true. It allows for apathy and all sorts of vices to take hold. So both extremes, I think, are very problematic, and so I'm advocating for this middle way where we journey, we spend a life pursuing God, pursuing truth, pursuing knowledge, and hopefully we have principles and criteria to sort of help us along that journey. One of the things that Woodhouse talks about, he asks the question, why be rational? I'm going to start at a different place. What does it mean to be rational? You know, often, if I asked you, picture a rational person, right? Picture someone who you consider rational or logical. You know, stereotypically, like the image that I used to get was like the image of Spock, right? For those that know Star Trek, where you have this man with very sort of diplomatic, pointy ears, you know, Captain, yes, if we go through with the mission, 100 will die, but if we do not, 150 will die. Clearly the answer, right? And it's like this very logical, no emotion involved, just, here it is, Captain, the facts and nothing more. I can't think of his name, the guy from Dragnet, you know, just the facts, man. This uber rational person that we have in our mind, and we typically say rationality is opposed to emotion. So the rational person is like the robot. It's Data from Star Trek. It's Spock. It's other thing, Sherlock Holmes. And certainly there's elements of rationality there. But I don't think that's the proper way to think of rationality, as though it's devoid of all emotion or something like that. Or that the rational person has all the answers. You know, the rational person is almost like a mathematician or this like computer who you give the input in and they spit out the answer. I think that the rational person has to embody certain character traits, certain qualities. I think the primary one, and you see it on your screen, rationality is really about being open-minded. I almost think of being rational as a kind of procedure or way of doing something, way of doing things. And part of this is having an open mind, right? It means I recognize I don't have all the answers, which means there are answers out there. I should be looking for them. These answers, this knowledge, these truths, probably at least in part exist in other people, other cultures, other political views, other genders, other age groups. I need to be open-minded to these people, these groups, and these individuals, so that whatever elements of truth they might have, whatever good ideas and bits of knowledge they might have, I can glean, because now I'm open-minded to them. I'm listening to them. I'm present to them. If I shut myself off from people that disagree with me, from people that I think are just clearly wrong, and I close myself off, then whatever they had to offer is now lost. Whatever truth or knowledge I could have gotten from that group or those people is gone. I think of it this way. If I look at another person, another viewpoint, another philosophy as a threat, then I lose it as a gift. Whatever gift I could have gotten from that is gone. And human nature, it seems, is often we want to look at people as threats, right? When the new person moves into town and shows up in class, we're sort of eyeing him. Is he going to take my spot on the baseball team? He's not that funny. Does my girlfriend think he's cute? Or whatever. We immediately start to assess the new person as a threat. But that means that whatever that person could have been in my life, whatever gift they could have been, is now gone because I've seen them as a threat. What happens with ideas, theologies, philosophies, politics, other things? So instead I suggest being rational is being open to the other, being open to the new. Now, I'm not suggesting, the saying is you're so open-minded that your brain falls out. I'm not suggesting that we agree with everything we hear, read, see, discuss. It's not about agreeing. It's about listening. Look at the pointer there, right? When I listen to someone and I really listen, it doesn't mean I have to agree with them at the end, but it means I'm open to what they have to offer me. That's a rational way of going about something. But typically, my personality is, well, I'm gonna listen in such a way that I'm just gonna wait for you to stop talking, right? I'm just gonna wait for you to sort of shut up. And once you're done, then I can give my opinion, I can sort of set you straight, give the perfect analogy or biblical verse, and now the argument's settled. But I didn't really listen. I didn't really hear you. I just waited for you to stop talking so I could interject my own view. We have to be careful of this. Really listen in such a way that says, I might be wrong and you might be right. I might be wrong, you might be right. We might be wrong, they might be right on certain issues, and we need to listen. This requires, of course, if you look down here, the Christian virtue of humility. The one thing, more than any other, that stands out to me about studying philosophy is that it is humbling. I am constantly humbled by what I don't know and by those that know more and that are smarter and have lived longer and thought harder about things. Can we humble ourselves enough to be open-minded and to realize that we don't have all the answers and that we need to go out into the world to others, listen to other viewpoints, to maybe get a more robust, holistic view, right? That this stuff might empower us in certain ways in our perspective. But doing that, this kind of procedure is rational. I mean, I think of the rational person as the one who is willing to take the conversation further. The rational person is Socrates, who never shuts down the conversation, continually asks hard questions, continually listens. Oh, you know something about justice? Well, tell me, what is justice? The person says it, they keep talking. Over time, it's like, oh, I guess you didn't know that much about justice. Well, what about this person over here? Hey, you, do you know something? And off he goes. And so it's this person who's willing to take the conversation further, who's willing to be humble, to listen, and to be open-minded, to honestly consider the views of others. I think rationality also means being critical of one's own views. Ask yourself, why do I believe this? Why do I think this? Does this fit in? Is it holistic with my other ways of thinking and acting and behaving? I mean, I want to continually be critical because that procedure, this way of living, ends up being rational. You know, my wife, she's much more emotional than I am. She's much more up and down like a roller coaster. But I still think she's really rational. She is self-reflective, and she asks good questions. And there's never been a time where she's stuck her head in the sand and like, la, 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 la. She will continue to fight, listen, ask questions. And I'm not always willing to do that. I'm more like, hey, look, that's it. We disagree. Let's agree to disagree, and that's the end of it. I think that's often more irrational on my part, to stop the conversation and become closed-minded. So this is my personal sort of view of rationality and the attitude I sort of want you to bring to the course. Why be rational? Well, I'm not sure you can learn if you're not rational. If you're not open-minded and willing to admit that there are things that you don't know, then you're not, how can anyone educate you? You already know it all. You already have the truth. To be educated is to say, I don't have all the answers, and I want to learn, and I want to listen and be humble. So the rational attitude allows for education and for learning and for growth and for transformation. It allows us to pursue truth. It puts us on the road to pursuing truth. And so I think rationality is very important. Critical thinking, related to rationality, obviously. A little water. Britney Spears headset. All right. Woodhouse actually defines critical thinking on page 42. He defines it this way. Critical thinking is purposeful, goal-directed thinking that follows a principled, reasoned track. Critical thinking is purposeful or intentional. It doesn't happen accidentally. You have to attack a subject, a topic, a piece of scripture, a personal belief intentionally with the purpose of raising difficult questions, with the purpose of saying, why do I think the way that I do? I want to get at the truth of Galatians chapter 5 and really ask tough questions. I'm going to look at commentaries, biblical scholars, theologians, other pastors who maybe have preached on it, and really try to get a well-rounded view of what Galatians 5 is saying. That's purposeful, that's intentional, that's critical. It's not, let me tell you what critical thinking is not. It's not agenda-driven. I believe this about Galatians 5, so I will only look at sources that I know agree with me, that I know will support my view as it is now. That's agenda-driven thinking, where I just look for evidence that supports what I already think. Talk to people that I know already agree and think the same way I do. It's like-minded. No. Critical thinking is going to ask tough questions of itself and of others to really pursue the truth and get a more robust, well-rounded view of a particular topic. So it's intentional, goal-directed. I really want to know the truth with regard to the moral status of abortion. And I'm going to dig into it and ask hard questions and research and gather evidence and really try to look at pro, con. Are there exceptions? When? Am I open-minded, right? And really trying to get a sense of what good responses and good arguments are regarding this topic and what bad arguments are. And it becomes pretty clear over time as you begin to practice critical thinking who provides good perspective and who doesn't, right? Now, most of us are closed-minded to certain issues. That's descriptive. There are things that I'm closed-minded about. I don't think I should be. I think in the areas where I'm closed-minded, I need to learn to be open-minded. And I would say the same for you. If I'm pursuing truth diligently, then I have nothing to be afraid of. Because wherever truth is, God is there. So why should I be closed-minded and say, well, that can't be, I don't want to listen to that, I don't want to hear that person or that group? Why? If I'm doing it with the intent of pursuing truth, God is in the midst, right? And so I think critical thinking is here to crack us open and force us to say, man, I am closed-minded about the topic of homosexuality. I don't like it, it makes me uncomfortable, I think it's wrong, it's a sin, abomination, whatever. Okay, but shouldn't you still be willing to talk to people who are homosexual and ask them why, when did they know, why do they think it's a legitimate way of living? Shouldn't we be willing to read and hear those, both Christian and non-Christian, who think it's not a sin and really ask tough questions and ask why and get a better sense of who they are and to really listen and humble ourselves? I mean, wouldn't that be a better approach, even if in the end we say, you know what, after all of that, I still believe the way I did at the beginning. That happens all the time. But I can almost guarantee you, if you do it, you'll be softened. Your view will be more, there'll be more humanity to it, a more robust and well-rounded view rather than being closed-minded. So critical thinking, purposeful, intentional, goal-directed, principled. There are principles of critical thinking that help us evaluate ideas, right? Principles and what I would even call criteria for evaluating, and we're going to move there at this point. In the Woodhouse text that talks about skills of critical thinking, that's on page 43, But a more detailed view of the skills are going to be in chapter 5 here. So what I'm going to focus on at this point, and a few of these show up in Woodhouse, I'm going to look at a few principles or criteria for critical thinking, right? So how do we evaluate ideas? How do we implement these skills? Okay, so critical thinking, evaluating arguments. One principle or criteria we call clarity. When we make arguments, and in this class when you write your papers, clarity is a key. It is so important. I can't stress it enough. You have to be clear. What do you mean when you say X? What does this look like, right, when you're outlining your paper as a whole? Can you provide the reader, the hearer, the listener with a sense of clarity? When you're evaluating ideas, clarity allows you to know what ideas are strong and which are weak. Politics, I have that as an example here. When you, in the middle of a debate, a political debate, two candidates get asked a question about economic policy as an example. And one candidate has lots of lofty goals, speaks in a lot of generalities. I'm going to improve the economy and add jobs and lower taxes and decrease the national debt. But it's very vague. How is it going to happen? What's the plan? How does this look? The next candidate says, I'm going to add 100,000 jobs and I'm going to do it by X, Y, Z. Boom, boom, boom. I plan to lower the national deficit by cutting military spending by this much, cutting social services, very specific things. At the end, it's clear which candidate provided the stronger argument. One is clear and one is vague. And I think these are universal standards that a clear idea and a clear definition is better than a vague one. Clarity, we find it in all sorts of areas. In politics, one of the things that happens a lot is we talk about freedom. Everyone loves freedom. Freedom, freedom, freedom. No one wants to disagree with it. But often what we mean by freedom differs. For instance, conservatives, when they talk about freedom, typically mean as long as no one interferes, I'm free. As long as the government or my neighbor does not interfere, then I have the freedom to do what I want. Often in more liberal circles, freedom is seen as not just non-interference, but I'm not really free unless I have certain things provided, a minimum wage, a certain standard of living, certain life opportunities, education, things like that. And so freedom requires that something be provided. Well, those are two different ways of thinking about freedom. It's the same word, but you see how that lack of clarity leads to all kinds of confusion. The second sort of criteria or principle of critical thinking, consistency. And here consistency means, does the argument have internal contradictions or logical inconsistencies? So within the argument, there's actually incompatibilities, logical inconsistencies within it. Two things that both can't be true, right? A logical contradiction. And this happens periodically. I'm going to give the example, a theological example. I go to church, and often, not every Sunday, but enough, I will hear phrases like, everything happens according to God's will, everything happens for a reason, everything happens according to God's plan. If that's true, then God is in control of all events, right? If everything happens according to God's plan, nothing happens outside of God's plan, which means I can't really be free. Because if I'm free, then I can do things outside of God's plan. I can do things outside of God's will, right? So if everything happens according to God's plan and according to God's will, God is in control of all events, making them happen for God's reasons, God's plan, God's purpose. At the end of sermons that incorporate that language, often I'm told, well, now go and love your neighbor, or go and tithe 10%, or go and do your devotions more, be it with God in prayer. And I always think, well, at the end you're asking me to make good choices, but the logic of your sermon is that I'm not really free, that everything happens the way God wants it to, everything happens according to God's plan. So I guess I'll go pray, if it's in God's plan for me to pray, but it's not because of my freedom. It's either in God's plan or it's not. I'll go and love my neighbor if it's part of God's will or God's plan, but if it's not, then I won't, because God is the causal agent for those events, not me. So we almost have to choose. This is a logical contradiction. If I'm free, I can do things God does not want. I can do things against God's will. I can do things outside of God's plan. If I'm not free and God's in control, then I can't be held responsible for my actions because God's in control, not me. So everything happens the way God wants it. But we can't have it both ways. Right now, I'm clapping my hands. Is God causing me to clap my hands? Is this God's will? Or am I choosing to clap my hands? We both can't be in control of this event. Either God's in control of this event or Joe Banker's in control of this event. So which is it? I'm free or God's in control? When we try to say both are the case, I think we create an inconsistency, a logical contradiction. This is why the theologies that stand the test of time are often either Calvinistic, so Calvin stands the test of time, he is consistent through and through, God is in total control. John Wesley, he stands the test of time. He emphasizes human freedom and that God is not in total control. But this blending of the two, I don't think will last or stand the test of time because it is inconsistent. As a principle of critical thinking, we realize this is not a good argument, right? How can it be both ways? That's not to say God's not in control of some events. It just means God can't be in control of all events, and I still have freedom. Another criteria, this is not an exhaustive list, by the way. I'm going to give 5 principles of critical thinking that we can use to evaluate ideas. Not an exhaustive list, just going to give, 5 I think that are important and often used. These criteria do not lead us to certainty, but these criteria help us with probability. Arguments that violate these principles have a lower probability of being true than arguments that incorporate them. Arguments that incorporate these are stronger than arguments that violate them. Coherence. This is different than consistency. Coherence, how well does the argument hang together? Here, there might not be internal contradictions, 2 things that both cannot be true, but it doesn't quite cohere. The pieces of the puzzle don't quite fit, right? I put Pac-Man Jones in here. I'm a football fan. That was one of the things I told you in the intro. I like football a lot. Pac-Man Jones is a football player. He's like a defensive back. He played for my favorite team, the Dallas Cowboys. I know, boo, I know. He wasn't a good guy. He was arrested multiple times, had various issues with the law in college and in the pros. So one of the things that was going on, he at one point went to a strip club, I believe it was in Detroit, and he of course has a whole posse of people that follow him around, and he went to the strip club. He had an altercation with a man in the strip club. At one point, Pac-Man Jones and his posse leave. The man eventually leaves later, and this is all on like video footage, right, of people coming in and out of the club. And this man was shot and killed. Coincidence, I guess. And the evidence pointed to one of the people who hangs out with Pac-Man Jones, who was like a gang member and not a nice guy himself. And he essentially, when he was arrested, said, yeah, Pac-Man Jones told me to do that. He had an altercation with the guy. He gave me the order, or whatever. Pac-Man Jones denies it, says, I've never even seen this guy before. I don't know what you're talking about. Several months later, as this is being investigated, he's in a strip club in Kansas City. The man, he says he didn't know, the man who shot the person outside the first strip club, they're seen going into the strip club together, which is kind of a coincidence. He didn't know this guy, but suddenly now they happen to be at the same strip club in Kansas City. He gets into another altercation with a different man, and coincidentally, this particular man who got into an altercation with Pac-Man Jones was shot in his car. Someone pulled up next to him and then drove away. So the idea again is, Pac-Man Jones, I have nothing to do with this. I don't know what you're talking about. The evidence pointed to a different person within his posse who said the same story about Pac-Man Jones giving him the order to do it. Is it possible that all these things are true? Is it possible that Pac-Man Jones had no knowledge of the first person getting shot? He never told his friend to do it. He didn't know him at all, and that was just a coincidence. And then somehow, in the midst of those events, he became friends with the hitman. They then went to Kansas City to a second strip club and got into another shooting with a man he got in an altercation with, and right, he didn't give that order either, just a coincidence. All this is possible. There's no logical contradiction, but it's not very coherent. It doesn't hold together very well. The pieces of the puzzle aren't fitting because we think, that's not the way the world works. That's not the way people work. This can't be coincidence. It's too improbable. And so we get a sense that there is not a coherent, Pac-Man is not telling a coherent story, not giving a coherent argument. And so that's, again, different than logical consistency, but somewhat related. Comprehensiveness. If you've got two arguments, right, and one argument can explain this much data, take my hands in there, but then you have a second argument and it can explain this much data, including that which argument number one could explain, but then more comprehensive, we typically give more credence to that which is more comprehensive. Example, the geocentered universe. There were predictions that could be made based on star location and whatnot if we saw the Earth as the center and the sun moving around the Earth. There's evidence for it, right? I mean, 1,000 years ago, people stood and they saw the sun start in the east and move all the way across the sky and set in the west. Clearly the sun's moving. I'm standing here, I'm not moving, so it can't be me. But in the end, that, right, was proven false. Why? Well, yes, that worldview, that argument, can explain some of the phenomena, can predict some star locations and whatnot, but as soon as we move the sun to the center and that the Earth revolves around the sun, suddenly it explained not only the visual phenomena we have, but it could make way more predictions, many more accurate predictions, and it was sort of verified over and over from these different facets. It became a more comprehensive theory. It sort of swallowed it up. This happens in science periodically. Newton comes up with gravity, can explain some of the math behind why things fall to the Earth at the velocity that they do. But Einstein comes along and doesn't overthrow Newton, but Einstein comes along and says, yes, Newton, but given relativity and whatnot, there is some difference, right? He gives an explanation of how gravity works, not just why it works, but how, in terms of like this notion of space-time, and that bodies create warps in space-time, and those warps lead to, right, the planetary motions that we see. And Einstein sort of gave a more robust notion of Newton. The anomalies that we found in Newton were then explained by Einstein. So there's almost a replacement. A more comprehensive theory comes along. If I pluck a passage of Scripture out and I say, oh, this is what the passage means, and maybe I pluck a few other scriptures from different places to defend myself, but someone else comes along and says, yes, but if we stick this in its larger context, it gives us a more comprehensive view of what this passage might mean, as well as other passages. Well, at that point, you have a more comprehensive view of this scripture, and typically that's a better interpretation. We could use biblical interpretation with the other criteria. Think of contradictions. Romans chapter 8 says X, but if I interpret it a certain way that contradicts what is said in Romans 15, that's probably not a good interpretation. But one that can create a coherent, comprehensive whole that has limited contradictions, well, that interpretation is going to stand the test of time. We see it as being stronger. So again, we're weeding out weak arguments. We're pursuing strong ones, whether that's science, whether that's philosophy, theology, biblical interpretation. Right? These same principles can apply. Finally, compatibility. Does our argument, is it compatible with well-established facts? I develop an argument, whether it's theological, philosophical, scientific, or otherwise. Is it compatible with what we know about the world and evidence? One of the reasons in week 8 we're going to talk about neuroscience is that if I'm going to put forth a view of character formation and morality, a sort of philosophy of spiritual formation, I want it to be compatible with what we know about the human brain. I want it to be compatible with data and science. And so I think it is. I think the view of spiritual formation and morality that I'm going to put forward has evidence in the neurosciences. Well, that makes it stronger. If I put forth a view of human nature, human behavior, or morality that totally contradicts evidence, then that's going to be a problem. It's not going to be as strong. And so compatibility with well-established fact is also a good principle of critical thinking. I feel like this is going a little long, so try to stay with me. If you need to pause me or something, fine. But I just have a couple other things to say and then I'll be finished. If we apply the 5 criteria we've just covered to a criminal trial, this might be a good context to see how they might work out, right? So if a person is accused of a crime in which there is no clear and decisive evidence, such as DNA, no confession available, then the case must be decided using criteria that strongly resembles those used in philosophy. If you're a juror, you're on a jury, you have to listen to 2 arguments. The argument by the prosecution, the argument by the defense. You don't have a time machine. You can't go back in time. You don't have any video of the event. You don't know exactly what happened. You're going to listen to the evidence, and you're going to ask yourself, which argument was clear? Was the prosecution's argument really clear and concise? Did they explain the facts and the data? Or was the defense's explanation more clear? Were there internal contradictions in the prosecution's case? Things that couldn't both be true? Or were there contradictions in the defense's argument? Was it coherent? Did the argument put forth by the prosecution hang together, make sense, given what I know of human nature, motive, the evidence? You know, or did the defense give a more coherent argument? Which was more comprehensive? Maybe the prosecution could explain 40% of the evidence, but the defense could explain 98% of the evidence, given their argument. So the defense is seen more comprehensive given the evidence presented, right, than the prosecution, or vice versa. So you would want to ask these questions, right? Not only of the testimony, not only of the case as a whole, the argument put forth as a whole, but you'd want to ask these questions of each witness, each piece of evidence. Was the witness's testimony clear? Did the witness contradict themselves? Maybe the witness said, oh, yes, I was at the grocery store at 5 p.m., but then phone records show that they made a call from their house at 5 p.m. Well, you can't be at the store and at your house. Immediately you know there's a lie there, and that witness's testimony is not as valid as a witness that followed the principles of critical thinking and didn't contradict themselves. Did the witness's testimony hang together well? Did it fit what we know of the evidence presented? Does it fit what we know of human nature? Pac-Man Jones would not make a good witness because his story isn't coherent. It doesn't fit what we know given probability and whatnot. You get the point. So then I ask a question, right? We're talking about the value of rationality, the value of philosophy, the value of critical thinking. If you were falsely accused of a crime and found yourself on trial, what kind of jurors would you want? Jurors that were closed-minded? Jurors that by the look of you decided whether you were guilty or innocent? Jurors that only listened to half the story? Jurors that are biased or prejudiced? Jurors, or do you want rational jurors? Jurors that are open-minded? Jurors that are going to listen and humbly, consider both sides? Jurors are going to weigh the evidence and say, was it clear, consistent, compatible? My guess is you want rational jurors. And by the way, this is hard to come by. Rationality and critical thinking is not easy to find in our world. I get terrified of being falsely accused. It's like one of my worst fears, by the way. It's like an irrational fear I have. That I'll come home someday, something horrible will have happened, and suddenly people will be like, well, he didn't cry enough at his wife's vigil, or he cried too much, or he didn't seem sincere. And suddenly, like, all the focus will be on me. I don't know, right? And then I've got to be put up in front of a jury and let 12 people decide my fate. I don't have confidence that they're going to be rational and use critical thinking. I feel like it's often very biased, one-sided, and very difficult to find a group of people who are willing to say, let's weigh the evidence. Is there reasonable doubt? Is it consistent, comprehensive, coherent, and clear? And I think we want this in our juries if we were falsely accused because we know, intuitively we know, following this criteria leads us towards the truth, closer to the truth. It does help establish good from bad arguments. It does help us establish good from bad ways of interpreting Scripture. It does help us not give us certainty, the black and white truth, but moves us in that direction. And so part of the course is learning to be better at this type of thinking. Well, I hope this helps. I hope this starts you on your way as you begin to do the reading. Again, this is not exhaustive of the chapter. You need to do the reading. You'll need to do the reading to answer the reading reflections adequately, but hopefully this lecture helps and provides some insight and clarity along the way.